Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be talking about CSS3. Now, just like with HTML and HTML5, CSS is a standard that constantly evolves to adapt to new demands of websites. So CSS3 is the latest evolution of CSS, where we've added new properties and new features so that we can make our design even better. So if you remember in our diagram over here, all of these browsers have different developers, different teams that work on implementing their features. Now, in an ideal world, everybody agrees on what CSS does, and when new features and new properties are added, everybody implements them at the same time. But that's simply not the case. Some browsers might work with some property, some might not, because they haven't gotten around to making it work. So let's go back to our website. Now let's play with one of my favorite CSS3 properties. How cool would it be if when we hover over these pictures, the picture moves? Well, with CSS3, they've introduced something called transition. And if I do all 1 second, and I'll explain what that does in, 1 second. Image hover, so this should be familiar, where when we hover, we want the image to transform. This is a new property as well, and we'll say scale 1.1. So let's see what happens. I refresh. Look at that. My images are now moving on hover. Isn't that cool? What these properties do is say that I want the image to transition when an action is taken upon it, and I want all the properties to transition over 1 second. And what's that transition going to be? Well, when I hover, I want it to transform by a scale of 1.1. So it's essentially growing. If I change this to 4 seconds and I refresh, well, now it takes 4 seconds for the image to scale. You can see over here, I'm going to change this back to 1 second, just because it looks better that way. If I make this website full screen, you see that we now have a beautiful effect for our image gallery. And there's also another property called animation, which you can look at on your own. But again, CSS3 has brought in a lot of these new properties to make websites even more dynamic than they are now. But there is a little caveat to using such properties. And that is, you want to make sure that each browser has implemented a new feature. So if I go to one of our favorite websites, W3 Schools, they have a CSS browser support reference. And here you can look at all the CSS to make sure that browsers support whatever property you want to use. So if we go to transition, we see that it is supported by all latest browsers. But you also see that if we go to something like user select, they have this MS, Moz, WebKit line over it. And if we scroll all the way down, it'll show you that it is supported by Internet Explorer with prefix MS. What does that mean? Well, these are browser prefixes, and you'll see them every once in a while. What it is these are new features of CSS that haven't fully been implemented by the browsers, and you want to use a prefix to make sure that they work as an experimental feature in the browser. Let me explain what that means. If I wanted to add let's say a box shadow, so that means kind of making this look 3D and having a shadow underneath the edge over here, previously I had to do something like this, where I put box shadow, and you can read into the property to see what I'm about to do, but I'm going to do 4 pixels, 4 pixels, 5 pixels, and then the color, which is a bit of a gray. So if I do this and refresh, well, that looks nice, and my browser is the new Chrome, so it has this feature. But a few years ago, when box shadow was first introduced, you had to do something like this, box shadow. And then copy and paste this. And this makes sure that it works on the Mozilla browser. And then you also had MS, which made sure that it works on Internet Explorer. You had WebKit, which made sure that it works on Safari and Chrome. And then finally, you also had O, which made it work on the Opera browser. And then you also had to still mention the box shadow without the prefixes at the bottom. So now, if any of these browsers don't support box shadow, well, they have these prefixes so that it should work. And box shadow, it has been some time now, so you don't need to do this anymore. But there is one great way of seeing if a certain property still needs browser prefixes, and that is using something like this, which I will leave for you so you can check it out. Another thing I wanted to show you is Can I Use? So caniuse.com is a great resource to see anything that you might want to try out. So if I type in here CSS transition, you'll see CSS3 transitions are supported in all these browsers, except we have one, Opera Mini, and it says it's 2.63% of the global usage. So if you use CSS3 transitions, 2.63% of the population might not be able to see it. Now, whether that is your user base or not, you can kind of decide what the trade-offs are. But this is a great thing to use. And if we use something like Flexbox, well, we see that Flexbox has all support. So it shouldn't be a problem for you to use it. Okay, let's go back to this and just finish up this website to make it look nice. So I don't like that there's space here. Ideally, this is all the way to the left. If I do margin 0 pixels and I refresh, that actually doesn't change much because sometimes browsers have their own default margins. So the way to get around it is to do margin 0 for the body. So margin 0 pixels, let's save and refresh. Perfect. Now we have this all the way to the left. Okay, but we do want a bit of a buffer at the top, so I'm going to add margin top, and we'll do 10 pixels. Save and refresh. Perfect. Now we have a beautiful website. And it didn't really take us much. We just wrote a few lines of CSS, a few lines of HTML, and look what we have. I'll see you in the next one.